So this is where our users and our developers are going to be going to deploy and model their applications. So you can see first off, this demo environment I've connected to 3 clouds. I've got 2 ACI back clouds and 1 AWS cloud. Day to day, what my users are going to be doing is they're going to be over here in the applications pane. And this applications pane is going to provide a catalog of apps that I've either downloaded that are already modeled for me, or I can model, of course, my own applications. But these are kind of the building blocks that I would use to develop a new application. So if I was a day-to-day user, and let's say I'm rolling out a new, let's say a pet clinic. Let's look at our F5 example. So all I would have to do, this pet clinic application has already been modeled by someone. They've already defined what are the tiers, what are the dependencies, what services are running, what scripts are going to be deployed when this guy comes up. So as an end user, all I would really have to do here is enter a deployment name. And from here, I could just click submit and deploy. But I want to point out a few things here. So I could just submit this. But you'll see we can do, we have the ability to do versioning. So if I'm testing different versions, maybe 1.02 is not production yet, but I want to do some more testing on that. You'll see also in the cloud drop down here, this is where I can choose between where it's deployed. So I can have this application and all of its tiers deployed in a single data center. I could also do a hybrid deployment. So maybe I want the F5 deployed in AWS, and maybe I want all the other tiers deployed in my ACI data center. So I have the ability to split out those tiers across clouds if I want to. Another thing I'll point out here, the tag, so the associate tags, the administrator will create these tags and it allows them to do things like cloud governance. So I've tagged this, it defaults to production. So we saw there's the 2 ACI clouds. But if I were to maybe say, this is actually dev, pet clinic, then you'll see the clouds change. So the administrator has deemed, if you're doing dev work, I want you to use AWS. Maybe that's faster, cheaper for whatever reason, then you can expose it there. So that's a pretty powerful feature. And you can also expose different clouds to different users. You can have different clouds per application. So it's really flexible in making sure we're governing where our instances go and trying to rein in those cloud costs.
So if you're role-based, you could say Europe can only talk to Europe, or specific countries can only talk to specific countries when you got some particular policies and ordinances that have to apply for that.
Yeah, and that's a really common use case because CliQr has a lot of like government and a lot of secret U.S. 3-letter agencies. So it's very important to them. Their data is governed and stays in one place. And conversely, other countries, maybe because of our homeland security laws, they don't want to have any of their data touch U.S. soil, so it's not inspected. So we can ensure that we know exactly where all of my data is being deployed to and govern that.
Can you explain again the difference between in the cloud drop-down choosing ACI versus hybrid?
Yeah, so this application we've got a number of tiers. We've got an F5 load balancer on the front end, we've got a database tier, and an app server. So 3 different VM instances that are going to get deployed. If I wanted those all to be deployed in one, I would just select ACI. But maybe I want to split this out. So maybe I want database to be run on my ACI data center. Maybe that's more sensitive data and I don't want that out on a public cloud. But maybe the F5 and app server, I'm okay with that running on AWS. So then I could select hybrid, and then I would see a drop down for each tier where I want that to be deployed. So F5, I could choose data center 1, database, sorry, that one I said was AWS, but I've got it tagged as production. So we'll say that's data center 1. Now this I could tag as data center 2.
I see, okay.
Then I can go ahead and deploy this. And then what CliQr is going to do on the back end is it's going to go ahead and push out that configuration. So it's going to spin up an instance of the pet clinic application, install any services that have been modeled as part of that application. It's going to push the application profile to ACI, the EPGs, the contracts, the filters, all of that. Let's kick off something that's a little faster. Okay, so now we can see it's bringing up the different tiers. So this application has a SQL database on the back end and a web server. So this was modeled by someone else, and you can see that the arrow shows the order really the traffic is coming in and the dependencies. And CliQr will actually make sure that that SQL database on the back end comes up first. And it's actually making sure that it's up. We're actually looking and seeing. It's not just, some competitive options will just use a timer and say, okay, SQL usually comes up after X amount of minutes, and then they'll kick off the next tier. But we're actually ensuring that all the services come up on that database before we bring up the next tier.
Is this instantiating it as a virtual machine or like a Docker or container instance?
Could be either. So you could do VMs, you can do Docker instances as well. Yep.
Or whatever at the respective cloud provider, Kubernetes or something along those lines.
Yep.
Cool.
So if I click on a tier here, we can actually see where it's getting deployed, which cloud I deployed it to, and then I'll actually see the name of the VM that is starting. So I could go back and correlate that to within my vCenter. I would be able to find this VM and see, okay, that's part of this application. So it gives us a lot of visibility.
Is it possible to deploy to multiple data centers at the same time? You know, if you have a global application that you want a web and application tier in 2 data centers for site redundancy or something?
Yeah, so that's where you'd use the hybrid option and deploy those tiers to different data centers, yeah. Yep. So we can see here, I've got some deployments, some that we've already spun up prior, but we'll see all of the different applications. We'll see which cloud it's deployed to. And then another really powerful feature here is the ability to do cloud costs. So I can set a cost per VM hour, and I can do that either based on the whole application. I can do it based on a cost per tier, or maybe there's a particular service that I want to charge more heavily for if it's leveraged. So it allows me to compare and make sure that I can compare what I'm spending in X cloud versus Y cloud and make decisions on where I'm going to place my new applications. And I can also, I'll show you in a little bit here, we can do things like charge back and create usage plans for different departments, or service providers really like that. They can have different customers as different tenants on the same CliQr instance, and they can provide usage plans and do that charge back as well. So, and that's all built into CliQr. A lot of times that's a third-party add-on to do that chargeback capability. So we want to have just this single place where we're managing everything end-to-end for the entire application.
Now, what if you deployed something as a 2 gig of RAM, 1 CPU instance, and you're like, well, this thing's blowing up. I need to increase this. Is using this from a lifecycle standpoint, is there a migration path to make modifications to that without having to just redeploy something new larger and then migrate or whatever?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that you could do that. You can set scale options, and you can actually say for a given application, maybe when the CPU gets above 85%, I want to go ahead and have CliQr scale that out. So it will do that for that bursting time, and then it can also scale back in if we go below a certain level. CPU is just one of the ways that we can do that. Sure. Yep, absolutely. The other way that you could do that, when you actually model the application, you set the minimum CPU and memory. So in the next version, you could up that. So the new instances that are deployed have more CPU memory. Yeah, that's something that CliQr could scale on demand, though.
Oh, cool.
So once an application is up, let's look at one that's deployed. CliQr can also act like kind of a jump box. So if I'm a developer and I got this up and I want to go just log in, make sure it's running, I can just click here and I can SSH in to this application. Let's try a different tier.
If you're leveraging GCP, does it integrate with the native cloud shell that they have in there, where it generates a dedicated certificate just for the purpose of that instance, so you can get a secure SSH connection?
Is that on the Google Cloud side?
Yeah, the Google
The
Cloud.
Google Compute? I believe so. I have not seen that in action, but yeah, it's going to take, that's what the orchestrator is going to do, is look at each of those cloud-specific features and be able to configure that without having to expose it to the user. So what that actually looks like with an ACI perspective. I come into, this is the tenant that I pointed to when I made the connection between CliQr and ACI. It's pointing to this CliQr tenant. I'll see my pet clinic application profile that's been pushed in for me. And I'll be able to see the EPGs, contracts, filters, subjects, all of that good stuff. I'll let that load for a second. Now, in terms of what clouds are supported, so if I'm now that was kind of the day-to-day user, but if I'm the super admin of the whole CliQr environment, in my infrastructure, this is where I'm going to be setting up clouds. So I've got the 2 ACI clouds. I'm connected to AWS. So adding a cloud is really just a matter of selecting the cloud, and then we'll create a region that's just pointing to the IP address that we're going to and the credentials. So setting up a new cloud is pretty trivial. CliQr already knows how to talk to all of these clouds. And there's more being added all the time, right? It's not too difficult for CliQr to do. So if we've got enough interest in other clouds, that's something that we can easily add.
Going off a little what Brandon, I think, was hinting at earlier. So you have all these various clouds. You attach to them. You do the communication and provisioning through the API. Mm-hmm. They turn around, have a new version of API. They change a bunch of stuff. Everything changes. How is the update process for you guys on your end to then allow me to get back in there and do what I need to do with my infrastructure?
Yeah, so CliQr is, they're very tied in with the teams in terms of the API. So they're able to respond very rapidly to changes and push that out.
Okay,
So
it would just be a regular patch or update?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I believe they can actually push it directly to the orchestrator in the cloud. I'll have to check on the back-end process. But since the orchestrator is sitting out there in that cloud, that's something that could be updated locally as well.
Okay.
Let's see. Now let's look at more if I'm a developer and I want to model a new application for the business. So let's say I'm going to create a new profile that's going to be just a tiered application. This is our topology modeler. So we have all of the services on the left that have been provided in a repository. So I can do things like add, drag and drop. I want a load balancer on the front end. Maybe I'm going to have a database on the back end here. And then maybe what else do we want here? Maybe I also want NFS. And also here's proof of the support for Docker containers, so I can drag and drop something to deploy as a Docker container. And then what I've got over here on the right is where I can set things like what services do I want to run, what scripts do I want to run once the app is deployed. So we're not just deploying the app and then the user has to go install all this stuff. If I'm a developer, I can do that, model that once here and provide those scripts so that subsequently when anyone deploys this profile, that application's ready to go. So I can do that. The firewall rules, simply just which ports are going to be permitted to talk to this application. And that's actually If this is going to ACI, those are directly translated to filters within the contracts. So within the ACI perspective, if I were to hover over one of these contracts, I can see the filter entry for port 3306. That was because this application was modeled to have port 3306 in that firewall pane. But we don't say contract, we don't say filter, right? We don't expose any of that in CliQr because we want it to be agnostic to whichever cloud we're going to. So that's how I can model a new application. I can set, again, the minimums for things like CPU and memory. Hardware specs, that's where I'd configure this. So that's how I'd be modeling a new application, and then I could just drag to show the dependencies. And again, on the ACI side, that goes back to the provider-consumer relationship of the contracts within ACI. So it will configure whatever objects are relevant to the cloud that it's going to, but the user has the same experience despite what cloud they're configuring. That's how we'd model a new application. And once you have apps modeled, so the developers are kind of using this to map out their apps, take it through the life cycle, the marketplace is kind of like an app store. So once you have these pre-built apps and you want your end users to deploy these, it's ready to go, it's gone through test and QA, then we can expose those in the marketplace. And we can also do multi-tenancy. So again, I could have Coke and Pepsi running on the same CliQr instance. They could have completely separate environments, different profiles, different marketplaces, right? Truly get their own user environment, but still using a single instance of CliQr, which is a huge differentiator.
I'm assuming someone who logs in here that's going to be modeling an app or creating something doesn't have to see everything, right? You've got some policy control where they don't have admin access, they don't have that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you can do very granular role-based access control too. You can limit what they're allowed to configure, which clouds they're allowed to touch, which applications are exposed. Yeah, so very granular. Almost out of time here, but I wanted to show you lastly, one of the more powerful features is tracking those cloud costs. So of course you can just pull the costs that are published from AWS today, but it's all completely customizable. So you can add like a premium on top for your users. So you can measure, based on the services that are running, the application, the tiers, even the operating system, measure the cloud costs. So we'll see the total VM hours, cumulative costs. We can map this out and say, well, how much are all of my pet clinic instances mapping to? How much is that going to cost me? So that allows me to evaluate, which cloud is best. We can also do benchmarking to see performance-wise. So not just from a cost perspective, but from an actual performance perspective, which cloud it's going to run on best. So again, it's not about, we're not trying to get folks to move to one cloud or the other. It's which is best for my application right now. And if that changes 5 minutes later, I want to be able to move it 5 minutes later.
And does it calculate these costs based upon some fixed values? Because some cloud providers, the longer you run in their cloud, the lower the price gets.
So if it's a public cloud, that's adjustable based on the prices that they're advertising. You can also do things, I mentioned the usage plans, so for each tenant or each user, we could set these different plans like you'd have through a cell phone provider, right? I've got X number of minutes, I've got X number of data. If I can do that by things like VM hour or a set cost, so I can actually do all that charge back. I can create bundles and contracts, so managing everything about the application from CliQr, deploying that app on any cloud, and being able to migrate between the clouds as well.
And you can associate that back to individual user credentials, groups kind of thing,
Yep.
which have the respective credit cards associated with it.
Yep.
Or whatever.
Yes, you can.
So you mentioned performance data. Is that actually getting the performance out of the application, the software running on it, the virtual machines? Okay.
Yeah, we're actually seeing what's going on and
I assume
seeing,
that's
like,
put
how
up
many
in pretty
users.
graphs and all sorts of
Yeah.
numbers and stuff on the interface?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see here, to answer your question, I can see reports by user, and then I can see their usage details. So, yeah, pretty much any feature you ask for is a yes. I'm honestly amazed every day by the things that I find in here. So, yep. Unicorns, not ponies. All right. Well, I'm out of time, but if you guys have further questions, let me know. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter at _vcarly. Thanks for coming.